All right, Shalom. I want to start off by giving all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh Bahashum, Yahweh Shai Bahashum, Rachak Kodash. I want to give double honors to our apostles and elders in Great Millstone who rule well in grace and peace. To you elect around the four winds, believing and pushing this truth in all sincerity. May the blessing of election be upon your houses. This is your fellow servant, Rakaya from the GMS Orlando camp, coming at you with another impromptu lesson. And back out here by the water again through the spirit, doing some reading and meditating on a few things. And I wanted to bring this exhortation for the laborers. A lot of the lessons that the Lord puts the spirit on you to do are for yourself. The Lord has given us a great tool in the form of this internet to utilize, not only to edify, exhort, and to feed the Lord's sheep, but to also edify, feed, and exhort ourselves in the process, and the laborers know this, more than most, that there are certain lessons that the Lord puts the spirit on you to do that hit harder than others. We all love to make videos. This is our passion. This is what we love to do, what we were born to do. And there's always an overwhelming sense of victory and accomplishment with each video we're allowed to complete through the Spirit. But there are some videos that the Lord pours out the Spirit on you to do that hit harder than others. When it comes to those videos, the Lord has it as such so that we're able to look back on those videos for a reference point and a guideline. The Lord may have you look back at a video that you made, years ago, to remind you of the fervency and diligence you had in the past to light a fire, to light that fire back under your ass, if it's getting dim. The Lord might have you look back at a lesson of exhortation or character building that you made, to get you back on track with practicing what you preach. Our channels act as a reference point and a guideline for us, at times. And a lot of the videos that we make through the Spirit are for ourselves, speaking of myself first and foremost, of course. Especially for brothers who don't get that many views. That one view, the Lord may intend to be you, to watch your own videos, to make sure that you're practicing what you're preaching. You're living according to the word that you're dishing out. You're being profitable unto yourself as well at the end of the day. Because there are many, that are profitable to others, but unprofitable to themselves. We're going to get that precept here in a second. But it was something I was meditating on, which was a statement that was made by the elder Arawam from Alabama about 3 years ago when he came down. And, he made the analogy of every brother's channel being like or likened unto another door in Yahweh Shai's mansion. You open up one door and a brother is going into history. You open up the next, it's exhortation. You open up the next, it's prophecy. You open up the next, it's character building. There are many doors in the Lord's mansion right now, in the form of brothers' channels and videos. And as we open up each other's doors daily, to get and to glean the knowledge, understanding, and faith from each room that we enter into, there comes a point where we have to go back to our room. It comes a point where you have to go back to your own room, and examine your own room and make sure it's up to par, and aligning with the will of Yahweh Hashem Yahweh Shai, and it's fit for others to come in. And that's where the scriptures speak about self-examination. This is 2 Corinthians 13 and verse 5. It says, examine yourselves whether ye be in the faith. Prove your own selves. Know ye not your own selves how that Yahweh Shai Hamashiach is in you, except ye be reprobates. And a part of examining ourselves is going back and doing the crosswork on the lessons that the Lord, put the Spirit on us to do. Going back to our channel, going back to your own channel and watching videos that you made in the past. Seeing where you can improve. Seeing if you're aligning, the Spirit of the Lord that was upon you at that time. Because all these videos at the end of the day are made through the Spirit and power of Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai. Every lesson that a brother makes, every lesson that you make, is of course through the Spirit. We can do nothing of ourselves. If it was of ourselves, a lot of us would have left off from the work years ago. A lot of us wouldn't even have put forth the foot to do the work in the first place. Every single lesson that's made is through the Spirit and power of Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai, which makes it even that much greater of a reference point for yourself. To see how the Spirit of the Lord was working upon you at that time. And examine yourself. It says, examine yourselves whether you be in the faith. Prove your own selves. Know ye not your own selves how that Yahweh Shai HaMashiach is in you, except ye be reprobates. And Yahweh Shai is constantly working through brothers. Constantly working through brothers every single day. Every single day. And the Lord has it, to where sometimes we're allowed to reflect on how the Spirit was utilizing us at one period in time. And it's a great reference point. It's a great reference point. Because sometimes, you'll find yourself getting cut by one of your own lessons. And that's how this word was designed. This word was designed, to cut when you're going too far to the left or too far to the right, and heal also in the same process. And that can happen not only with other brothers' videos, but with your own videos. You look back and you're like, damn, I'm tripping. You're right. I should be more encouraged. I should be more into prophecy. I should be more into whatever the lesson was going into. I need to get back at the diligence I had. I need to get back at that fervency. Whatever the case may be. But sometimes your own lessons cut, and it's supposed to be like that. And just as sure as the lessons cut, your lessons cut, they also heal. They also heal. The Lord has done a very marvelous work in the form of the work. The Lord has done a very marvelous work, man. This truth really is a fascinating spectacle to behold and be a part of. It's a great mercy, because this truth is multifaceted. We're learning that not only are we able to edify and exhort and feed each other, through the making of videos, but we're also able to do the same within our own vessels. And that's why it's important to put forth diligence and effort into your lessons, to put out quality lessons and not just BS to fill the quota. The Spirit should be on you to do more than the quota. The Spirit should be on you to study, to read, to pray, so that you have a room that other brothers can enter into, and also a room that you can dwell in as well. I'm gonna get this. This is Ecclesiasticus. This is Sirach of Ecclesiasticus, chapter 37 and verse 19. It says, "There is one that is wise and teacheth many, and yet is unprofitable to himself." All right, we don't want to find ourselves in this case to where, we're wise and, we're able to teach many, but when it comes to our own vessels and how we apply Yahweh Shai in the word, we're unprofitable to ourselves. We want to make sure that we're also practicing what we preach and embodying the word of Yahweh Bashem Yahweh Shai. Because at the end of the day, that's the goal of each lesson, all right, to bring us closer to the embodiment and mindset, the like mind of Yahweh Shai. And that goes for exhortation videos, that goes for historic videos, prophecy, whatever the case may be. News outlets, news lessons. Whatever the case may be, the goal at the end of that lesson is for us to gain in faith, increase in faith, and to also increase in our application of Yahweh Shai, and draw our minds closer to the like mind in Yahweh Shai. Every video has a purpose. Every video has a purpose. Even your own. I just want to bring that quick, exhortation. Lord, when this is edifying unto you, elect, something I was meditating on. Just want to hit the button, man. A lot of the lessons the Lord puts the Spirit on you to do are for yourself. You're able to look back and see whether or not you're aligning with the will of Yahweh Bashem Yahweh Shai, whether you're aligning with what you've been preaching. We don't want to be unprofitable to ourselves, but wise to many. At the end of the day, that's unfruitful. We want to not only be, wise and profitable to many, but also profitable to ourselves. And we want to make sure that our room is fully dressed so that others who come in are able to be edified as well. And it's a room that we're pleased to dwell into. A room that we're pleased to dwell in our own selves, man. And all this comes through self-examination, which is important now more so than ever. With the days that we're entering into, self-examination is key, because Satan is trying his best to overcome us mentally, spiritually, physically. The wiles of the devil are becoming stronger. The deceit of this world is becoming stronger. The spiritual attacks are getting more frequent. So we want to make sure that we ourselves are on point with the will of Yahweh Bashem Yahweh Shai. And we can do that a lot of the times by referring back to our own videos. If you find that fire, being dim within your spirit, which, hey, we in some beautiful times, man. That fire should not be dim. That fire should not be dim, bro. We have a lot to look forward to, man. We're in an unprecedented time right now. You got to realize what's happening before you. The Lord is performing a very marvelous work before you right now. That is something that should be increasing your faith rather than dimming it. But if you find, that light within yourself dimming, go back and look at some old videos of the fervency and diligence that you had when you first came into the truth. When you had that feeling that Yahweh Shai was coming yesterday. You had that feeling that you had to catch up. That spirit of that very heavy, diligent spirit of studying was on. Go back and reference. Go back and reference how, you were doing, a lesson on exaltation, or character building. Go back and reference that video and see whether or not you're aligning with what the Spirit was upon you to say before time. We're doing the same thing essentially with prophecy. All right, the prophets received the vision of old. All right, and every day we're seeing and examining whether or not we're aligning with what was said of old. All right, there was a certain characteristic and mindset that was prophesied for the elect to be in the latter days. And every day we do examination, cross examination on ourselves to see whether or not we're aligning with the will of the Heavenly Father, whether or not we're aligning with what the Lord said the elect would be doing in these latter days. All right, we do the same thing with the words and the prophets of old. You know, sometimes, sometimes, a lot of times, the Lord allows you to be your first line of defense. The Lord is teaching us to be our own first line of defense, to possess the capability of checking things within ourselves before the brethren have to, you know, possessing the ability to judge within ourselves, before things get out of hand. A lot of the videos the Lord allows you to make through the Spirit are for yourself. Go back and reference. All right. That being said, that's all I had. I don't want to beat a dead horse. Lord, when this is edifying unto you elect, I want to give all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahushai, Bahasham, Rachak Kodash, and double honors to our apostles and elders of Great Millstone. Well, grace and peace to you elect. Shalom. Stay up.